This is just a reminder to subscribe to enjoy our growing collection of paranormal content. Don't forget to like your favorite episode and ring the bell to be notified of new content. As always, thanks for watching. A massive stone castle once stood in Florida, deemed the House of Tragedy or the House of Horror. The home stood for 100 years and might still be standing if anyone could have lived within its walls. Even the most astute historians have forgotten this location, once a fixture in Florida's folklore. This home resided in the Lee County area, near a small village known as Samville. The largest nearby city was Fort Myers. Its history and lore is already the subject of an upcoming novel, but what is the story behind the legend? A prospector named Richard Martin Smith toured the old Lamier estate in the 1890s. He had a million ideas for what to do with the abandoned property. He'd worked hard in an Alaskan gold field and had amassed enough to retire. He wanted to live somewhere warm and comfortable, and that place was Castle Lamier. Locals warned him about the home's haunted reputation, but he wouldn't listen. He dismissed the warnings as ridiculous superstition. He'd spent years surviving harsh Alaskan winters. A few haints were the least of his worries. The house was structurally sound. It was stone, so its skeleton was impervious even to Florida's humidity. All it really needed was some cosmetic renovation. He renovated the house, installed electricity, and modernized the plumbing. He brought in new furnishings and had the home redecorated. He then moved his family in. The first day was fine. He thought the locals were ignorant and he'd gotten a bargain. Then night came. Horrendous noises began at bedtime. The family heard wine glasses clinking, champagne bottles popping, and the constant back and forth of poker chips and card dealing. They heard people talking and laughing. Strange lights and footfall came and went in the halls, as if tens of people moved through the home. Disembodied footfall was everywhere. After several hours of the phantom party, more ominous sounds began. Suddenly, the phantom footfall rushed by the bedroom doors on the upper floor. A young woman screamed and pleaded for her life. A man swore and angrily shouted. After another scream, a body thudded down the main steps. The entire family heard liquid dripping down the main steps onto the floor. Whispers came from all directions. They heard drunken laughter and sounds of slaps and punches. The noise escalated with the sounds of someone being violently punched, as if someone was beaten to death. The exhausted family emerged from their bedrooms after a restless night. Smith had second thoughts about his grand house. Even in daylight, something about the stairway landing now prompted everyone to step over an unseen object. The family knew nothing of the home's history and didn't want to. They agreed it was not the house for them. Smith put the house on the market for a ridiculously low price, where a real estate man named Phillips promptly picked it up. Real estate mogul John Phillips wanted a good deal. He bought the newly renovated house for much less than he imagined, around $1,900. He was convinced he could make a fortune off the old place, regardless of whatever Smith claimed. It would have made a fine resort or a spa and health retreat for the wealthy. He went as far as authoring several articles for Florida newspapers on how superstitions ruined promising properties, such as Castle Lamier. Phillips decided he would have to prove the stories false himself. He invited 12 distinguished men to stay in the house for a week. He chose well-educated, successful individuals to lend credibility to the experiment. The group included both a minister and a priest. To prove his confidence, the haunting was superstition, he brought his 4-year-old daughter, Mary, with him. The men arrived before lunch. His first order of business was to debunk the stairway story. Legend said no one could cross the landing without instinctively stepping across something unseen. He knew nothing was there and would use his daughter to prove it. He said Mary was too young to understand the stories, so she couldn't believe them. He placed a dish of candy on a table at the top of the steps and instructed her to go get a piece. The child slowly made her way towards the candy bowl. To Phillips's dismay, the child hesitated on the landing, calculated her way around whatever was there. She then returned to her journey up the steps. The visitors were ready to leave. Every man in attendance begged Phillips to take his daughter from the house, even if he stayed. The group stated they had a bad feeling and just wanted to leave. In the first light of dawn the next day, Phillips's screams were heard in nearby Samville. He ran to the village with his little girl's lifeless body in his arms. His hair was white. Physicians said the child suffered heart failure due to shock. And Phillips came close to the same fate. He withered into a shell of his former self and never told anyone what happened that night at Castle Lamier. He let the property go, as Smith did, to anyone who would take it. So, did the castle's origins justify the notoriety? You be the judge. In 1803, a man known only as Marquis Lamier came to Spanish Florida. The dark and dashing stranger fled his native France due to the many crimes he committed there. Rumors claimed he achieved his sizable wealth through theft and murder during the Revolution. Florida was then a wild country. It would be another 17 years before the state became a part of America, but none of the home's inhabitants would live to see it. The Marquis built a stone castle on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River. The ideal area was close to the sea, but still private enough for his associates to come and go as they pleased. He obtained a great deal of land and created a magnificent stone manor with a matching gate. 20 slave cabins, also made of stone, were built around a quarter of a mile from the main house. The only nearby civilization was a tiny village that would one day be known as Samville. He purchased a quantity of slaves and set about farming his plantation. Locals grew suspicious. It was obvious Lamier knew nothing of farming or agriculture. But he had an enormous amount of money. He imported fine wines and exquisite liquors from all over Europe. When the house was complete, he brought 2 more residents to the castle. The girl was Antoinette Brissac, and he claimed she was his ward. Mrs. Pierre, the second inhabitant, claimed to be the housekeeper. The 2 ladies settled into their quarters, and life went on as normally as possible. Brissac was usually aloof and sad, while Pierre was a cruel and vengeful mistress. Most of the home's early history would have been lost, were it not for the reports of his slaves to the locals. Strange, brutal men often visited the castle. Lamier and his associates held wild parties nightly, and every visitor gambled with the Marquis. Card games often lasted for days at a time. Poor Antoinette was subjected to daily abuse through the ridicule and raucous comments from the Marquis's guests. She didn't speak English or Spanish, so her communication was limited. The Marquis kept her in a corner of the grand room so he could always keep an eye on her. The only tolerable periods in her life were spent with a slave named Aunt Cleo. Antoinette was 15 and looked up to Aunt Cleo like a mother. Aunt Cleo had the same affection for the girl. Both were trapped in a hateful place they didn't want to be. The 2 were inseparable when allowed. Aunt Cleo stood outside the grand hall at night, so Antoinette could see her, and remained there while the drunken guests harassed and groped the girl. Antoinette was not allowed to retaliate or otherwise anger the Marquise's guests. Antoinette quietly endured the daily torture for what seemed like an eternity. She longed for her native France and to be reunited with her family. They'd been separated by the horrors of the Revolution. The Marquis promised her father he would return her as soon as it was safe, and that had been years earlier. One Christmas Eve morning, Antoinette fled to Aunt Cleo's cabin in her nightdress. She sobbed and gasped for breath. It took a few minutes for even Aunt Cleo to calm her. She begged Aunt Cleo not to let the Marquis touch her. He'd told her he could do what he wanted with her, because she was his ward. He said he wouldn't return her to France because he'd killed her father himself. He said he would kill her, too, if she didn't let him do as he wished. Before long, both the Marquis and Pierre came for her. They physically carried the girl back to the house. Aunt Cleo remained in her cabin, terrified. She knew they would punish the girl worse if she interfered. Her worst fears were confirmed at noon. Someone sent for the sheriff in the village. Aunt Cleo felt sick as she approached the main house. She could barely move as she neared the main stairway. Antoinette's body was doubled up on the third step landing. Her head was almost severed from her body. Blood poured down the steps and created a pool on the floor. She bit her tongue until the authorities arrived. She couldn't keep silent. She accused the Marquis in front of the lawmen. She said he'd done it to Antoinette because she wouldn't let him touch her. Cleo didn't see him do it, but she wanted the Marquis to pay for her murder. She told the authorities she'd watched him cut the girl's throat. The Marquis had Cleo forcibly removed from the premises. She was escorted to her cabin. He said he would discuss the matter with her later. He and Pierre discussed Antoinette's deteriorating mental state since learning of her father's death. A large sum of cash, along with a few bottles of fine wine, encouraged the official to rule her death a suicide. Aunt Cleo fell victim to the same despondency and was found the next morning. She'd hanged herself, or so Lamier said. They got rid of Antoinette and Cleo, but their troubles had just started. 6 months later, Pierre was in the latter stages of delirium tremens. The slaves had endured her cruelty long enough. They decided to strike while she was weak. They chased her around the upper floor. She descended the main stairway where Antoinette died and slipped. She fell down the steps and her neck snapped upon impact with the floor. 1 year after the girl's murder, Lamier played cards with a new guest. Alphonse Latour visited the castle and suggested they play a game of cards to see who would lose everything. The game stretched out for 3 days. By Christmas morning, Latour was ruined. Instead of taking his losses, he made the bold accusation that Lamier cheated. He and Lamier stood with their pistols drawn. Both men fired. Latour died instantly, while the Marquis survived only a few minutes before he expired. The original owners were gone, but many later discovered the party didn't end. Locals were unsure of what to do with the house. Lamier hadn't used a legitimate name, so they had no hope of finding next of kin. The few associates who straggled in after his death fled when they learned of his demise. Purchasers came and went as fast as the house was sold. It was a gorgeous home, and in a prime location on the river. But no one could deal with the spirits. It was empty for 50 years before someone decided to give it another try. And that someone was Richard Martin Smith. The death knell resounded for Castle Lamier in 1906. The historic property was demolished on January 1st, 1907. The community decided to level the home and construct a resort atop the land. History did not record the castle's demolition. What was later constructed on the land remains unknown. The house, like its history, has been entirely forgotten. Marquis Lamier was not a real marquis. French peerages do not include Lamier or any similar name. As a matter of fact, Lamier, when translated into English, means knife. It can also mean nettle or bramble. Lamier was believed to be an associate of pirates, for Spanish Florida was rife with pirates who waited on ships to enter the Gulf of Mexico on the way to New Orleans. The house had national notoriety, but many in Florida knew nothing of its history. Several late 19th century Florida histories discuss several old stone houses that had stood for over 50 years, even then. Many assumed the structures belonged to the colonists under Turnbull. As to Lamier's great fortune, history recorded numerous cases of treasures stolen during the atrocities of the French Revolution. Lamier could have been a thief or a decadent noble who fled the frenzied mobs. In September of 1792, revolutionary thieves discovered a way into the royal treasury. The items stolen included the French crown jewels, among them the Sancy and Royal French blue diamonds. Several historians suspect the infamous Hope Diamond is none other than the Royal French blue. Florida land records prior to 1821 were all lost. Spain stored Florida's land records in Cuba for reasons unknown. When America assumed ownership, the records were gone. Despite 3 separate government attempts, they were never located. Their fate remains a mystery. This is just a reminder to subscribe to enjoy our growing collection of paranormal content. Don't forget to like your favorite episode and ring the bell to be notified of new content. As always, thanks for watching.